My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute. We're looking at the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. We've been comparing it specifically with Romans 5 to 8. And in Romans 5 to 8, specifically Romans 8, 17 and following, Paul put the resurrection specifically in the context of suffering. Paul said, if we are sons, then we are heirs. And if we're heirs, we suffer with him, and we will be glorified with him. And Paul said, I reckon that the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory that is about to be revealed in us. That glory was the adoption, the redemption of the body, Romans 8:23. So, without any doubt whatsoever, Paul is placing the suffering, and look, it is so critical to understand that the suffering that Paul was discussing, as I have mentioned already several times, the suffering that Paul was discussing was not the normal human experience. It was not, our bodies getting old. It was not cancer. It was not heart attacks. It was not financial difficulty. It was martyrdom, suffering for the cause of Christ. It was the sufferings of Christ, just as Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, where he said, we are always bearing about in our body the death of Christ and the sufferings of Christ. Well, the sufferings of Christ were not the normal human experience. He was here living for his Father, carrying out his purpose, living, may I use the term, living by faith. He suffered for who he was. And so, once we can realize that the suffering and the martyrdom that permeates all of these New Testament texts that speak of the then current ongoing persecution 2,000 years ago, and in the context of the very soon coming day of the Lord, judgment and resurrection, then we will have a better grasp of eschatology. Because that coming of the Lord, the judgment and the resurrection, was to give relief to that suffering community throughout the Roman Empire. It was to vindicate them as the children of God. It was to glorify them, and it was to bring eternal life to them. And as a result of finishing Christ's work in them, eternal life would flow eternally in the new heaven and the new earth. Now, let me pick up on another very, very important text that develops this motif of suffering and martyrdom. I call your attention to Hebrews chapter 10. In Hebrews chapter 10, the writer says, call to remembrance the former days in which after you were enlightened, you endured a great fight of affliction against yourself. And he said, I'm going to read, verse 32 and following. Recall the former days in which, after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings. That's persecutions. After they were converted. Look, if Paul's talking about normal human experience, they didn't have to become Christians to experience that, right? Anyway, partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches, and that word reproaches, once again, has to do with mockery, ridicule, with ostracism, and tribulations, Greek word thalipsis, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. In other words, they joined with others who were suffering the same thing. For you had compassion on me in my bonds, in my chains, the writer says, and joyfully accepted the spoiling of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring substance for yourselves in heaven. Suffering, faith in the inheritance. Suffering, faith in vindication. Suffering, faith in coming resurrection. Now watch. Therefore what? Knowing that you have a great inheritance reserved for you in heaven, do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward. Well, what is that great reward? It's the salvation that Christ would bring at his, quote, second appearing, unquote, Hebrews 9:28. For you have need of endurance. Endurance of what? Suffering the spoiling of their goods, the confiscation of their goods, the reproaches, the afflictions that they were enduring. You have need of endurance so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. What promise? The great reward, the salvation. Now watch. For, okay, you have need of patience so that you might endure and endure the great reward, or receive the great reward. For, in a little while. But the Greek here in Hebrews 10:37 is very, very powerful. It says, for yet in a little while. Well, the Greek is hoson mikron. And it means literally, how little, or how little. Very, very little while, the one who is coming. What would he come for? Salvation, Hebrews 9:28. To bring the great reward, right here, of verse 34 and 35. And you will receive the promise. Well, what's the promise? It's the inheritance of the new heaven and the new earth. Now, in a very, very little while, the one who is coming will come and will not tarry. The writer said that 2,000 years ago. The writer 2,000 years ago said to suffering saints that Christ was coming in a very, very little while to bring the great reward, to give them the promise, to bring salvation. And that means that great reward, that salvation, at the coming of the Lord is none other than the adoption of the body. It's the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. Thus, Hebrews chapter 10, properly considered, is an extremely powerful text teaching us that the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, the time of the great reward, the time of eternal life, was coming in a very, very little while.